Hi all. So today we're talking about observation and ethnography, part 2, second week. To look at ethnography as part and an expansion on observation, really have to think about how to implement conceptualization and operationalization, translating theory into practice in doing ethnography. There is a similarity to interviews, that you have to think about such work before, during, and even after data collection. Because you're always focusing on what concepts are important to answering your research question. That's what conceptualization does. Really thinks about how do you translate abstract ideas and then think about how you're going to operationalize it in how you measure the environment where you do the data collection. For example, if you're trying to think about what constitutes academic pressure, that's a broad concept. What are you going to look for in the field? Are you going to look for nervousness? Are you going to look for how people talk, things people say? All of those are taking a broad concept and translating it into things you're looking about for in the field. As you observe, you're going to find new behaviors that fit the concept that you hadn't thought of initially, and add them to what you're looking for. As far as preparing for data collection when you're going into the field, you have to get a sense of whether first you can get consent to even enter the site and stay there for a sustained period. You may, if you're doing an academic environment, get the institutional review board approval for whatever you're going to be doing. Do you have the informed consent you need? And make sure you get the formal informed consent from those you're dealing with, that they understand what you're doing, at least generally, and that they agree to it. Now, you often need to gain access through a gatekeeper, most likely, but you want to choose carefully for all the concerns we've had about how gatekeepers can affect how people view you within wherever you are doing observation ethnography. The gatekeeper, wherever you're going, should be seen as reliable and trustworthy by the people on the site. And one thing you want to do is practice talking to people, thinking about how people may respond before you even go to the site. Prepare whatever supplies you're going to need, notebooks, recording equipment, and so on. Now, the initial period of data collection is critical. Even if the ethnography is going to last for months, even years, what happens initially can set the stage for a lot of your work going forward. You first need to get the lay of the land, understand what are the different parts of the environment that you need to be observing and paying attention to, who are key figures that you want to be talking to, and so on. You want to meet people, get to know and be known by them as somebody, and over time become, essentially, as they say, part of the furniture. They may know you're an outsider, but they want you to have seen you enough that they treat you as somebody that's part of their day-to-day routine. And that's part of it. You want to learn the routines. You want to be there, be part of those routines, understand what routines shape people in that environment. You want to know the slang, just so you understand what people mean when they say and use words that you may not be familiar with. Most of all, you want to get a feel for life, how people live their lives, especially if it's different from what you're used to. There's a lot of field notes and different kinds of field notes you want to do to track the newness as you first get to the site. And it's really important that you furiously take notes before things become familiar and you start to forget that it matters that you're writing it down. You want to capture that sense of what's different, what's new. There's a phrase for this, what's called moments of strangeness. Those moments of strangeness are often key points of inquiry and insight, since if they strike you as new, as something you don't understand, that's often going to be key for understanding what the whole site is, how it differs from what you think of as conventional life. You may want to just take quick jotted notes throughout the day to jog your memory later, and then at night, when you're by yourself, expand on the notes when you have more time. But the important thing is you record extended notes the same day, or you're going to forget, especially the nuances that may have struck you when you first saw it. There's lots of what's called thick description, a term borrowed from ethnographer Clifford Geertz. As an anthropologist, he had noted that if you do lots of specific details, layer upon layer, over time, you get a sense and description of the environment that gives you more than you even understand initially. You just have the description, and then maybe months later, looking at your own description, you'll have new insights. What's also important is that you separate observations from interpretations and the hypotheses, hunches you have about what they mean. That kind of separation is probably one of the greatest skills you need to develop, because it's often easy to make assumptions about what you're seeing and much harder just to record it in its sort of raw, observable form. For that reason, you often take different kinds of notes, sometimes with separate notebooks. There are descriptive notes. Those are the things you observe directly, things you just describe with adjectives, with what you see, trying to do as little interpretation of what's going on and just sort of say, you saw this, you heard this. There are going to be personal notes where on top of whatever you saw, you're going to try some initial interpretations, any personal thoughts about it, sort of the informal thoughts. Then, as you try to think about it in a more systematic way, you may have your theoretical notes, again, maybe in a different notebook altogether, where you record new hunches, hypotheses, pull in sociological concepts from books you've read, try to interpret it against the backdrop of existing literature. And then separately, you're going to have methodological notes, documenting any sampling choices, i.e., who did you talk to that day? Who did you choose to talk to? And more importantly, who did you not choose to talk to? Did you have difficulties collecting data? Would somebody not talk to you? And so on. All of those methodological notes you should record as you go along so that you understand all of the barriers you ran into. There are other issues, additional factors in ethnography. You're often going to, once you're inside the site, adopt what are often seen as guides, insiders in groups that can help answer questions and help in research. You have formal interviews, even within your general observation, where you may take people aside, sometimes in a loosely structured format, but that helps you build on the observations you've had to extend, to confirm, to refute your hunches that you may be developing along the way. You're always, of course, going to be having informal interviews, which during casual conversations with members of the group, you then want to go back maybe later in the day and record what was said in more detail. You want to document whatever you do find, not always things people say, but just actual things you find, church bulletins, just even like the bar menu and what people think are funny jokes that are worth recording, because humor can often reflect values of community in very specific ways. And so it all extends the richness of the data about group studying, that you have actual physical, written, or other documents that show you how life is recorded in that community. Then you get to the point of data analysis. And the thing about data analysis and ethnography is it's happening all the time. You're continually testing hunches by looking for data that supports your initial hypotheses and seeing, if it's not confirmed, how to think about formulating new hypotheses and moving forward in that way. You're very importantly always looking for things that contradict your initial hypotheses, and that's often the most exciting, to see you thought the world might look a certain way. Turns out it operates in a different way altogether. The theoretical notes you take can help direct that data collection. It helps you develop those new hypotheses so you can follow on all the leads that you develop from your field notes. Later, once you pull together larger volumes of data, you're going to have a formal analysis of the field notes through reading and rereading and coding them, looking for patterns that you might not have seen initially. You always have to keep in mind, though, the quality of the data and the analysis. Your key goal is that any observation, ethnography, accurately reflects what's transpired. You want specific, detailed notes. That's the most likely to achieve the kind of validity where what you claim you're seeing actually reflects the broader reality. And that's why you want to keep your interpretation separate from observation. The observations should be accurate the day you made them, days later, but the interpretations can change as you have new information, new insights, new hypotheses that you have tested over time. You also want to demonstrate, as with regular interviews, rapport with your participants. So that means they're far more likely to have been acting naturally around you and that you're seeing how they live their lives when in actuality, not just a front that they may have put up because you're there. And as with all forms of coding, you want to identify the patterns that are supported by the data by seeing correlations between one set of phenomenon often correlating with another set of phenomena. Okay, you've done the work in the field. You may have spent months, you may have spent years, as many ethnographers do. There are many ways to present an ethnography. First, you could do it as a chronological story, the story of what happened when you first got on the site, and then documenting as you understood things better over time, and so you can tell the chronological story of your time in the site. You also may do it around themes. All of the information you had about family life in one chapter, another chapter about work life, another theme about leisure, and so on. There are many different themes you might organize it around, but you're not going to take it so much chronologically, but just pulling all the elements over the time there into those thematic chapters. It's also sometimes done around character-based stories. You find that there are 4, 5, 6, 7 people who just in their lives embody many of the phenomenon you're interested in talking about from that field, that they live their lives in particular ways that you think challenge the assumptions from outside that ethnographic site of how people do live their lives. And so you'll have stories of those characters one by one, even as other minor characters, of course, come in, but that's the thematic organization around those key stories of people. Now, the one thing about ethnography, because there is so much description, because there is so much detail, it's rarely short articles, usually in the form of a book, especially where you are having lots of thick description to sort of show the way societies operate in that kind of depth. Now, what are the key parts of an ethnographic write-up? Present the research question, almost where any study starts with sociology. But you also want to say, how did your research change in the course of data collection? It may change radically over time as you get new insights. So it's worth presenting what changed your sense of what was the best ideas to understand about that site. Discuss the methods of data collection, how you chose your site, why it was important against the background of the literature in the field, or any other criterion that made you choose this place. What were the role of gatekeepers in getting you access to it? What was your role as a participant observer, or a non-participant observer if you're trying to keep largely out of the space, and so on? How did you get permission from participants, and how did you develop rapport that they actually told you what they tell you? How did you take your notes? What was your process in writing them so people can understand how your thought process operated over the time you were there? And did your research have any effect on the participants you studied? Did you affect their behavior in any way and keep track of that? And then present your analysis along with the examples, the stories that support what you think is the way that community operates. Now, as an example, which actually is quite different from many ethnographies, going to talk about the Armando Lara Millan piece, Public Emergency Room Overcrowding in the Era of Mass Imprisonment. Unlike most ethnography, this is one that's not about a sort of general sociological study, but really has some very specific public policy implications. It has some quantitative aspects, and for that reason is actually far shorter than most ethnography. But it actually does show the way that ethnography gets information that is often harder to get through other methods. So let's talk about the initial literature review of this piece. One thing they had found, looking at the research, which is unsurprising in our general knowledge, is that public hospital emergency rooms bear the burden of caring for the urban poor. Private hospitals, usually, even if they get a poor patient, often transfer them rapidly to the public ERs. Public hospitals now provide 65% of uncompensated care in large metro areas, meaning care where there's no insurance company in sight. At the same time, there's been a large rise in incarceration in these urban communities and a proliferation of what the writer calls crime control language, often applied in non-criminal justice settings. Prison increasingly becomes the primary social service provider to many of the poor. Here's, in some ways, a sad statistic. Incarceration increases the health of African American men, but you end up with worse health outcomes for ex-inmates and their families. So the question is why? That drives the research question and study here. How do incarceration, policing, and crime control language interact with the admissions process of the public emergency room? The author did 13 months of fieldwork to identify these dual effects of crime control trends on urban public emergency room healthcare. Their hypothesis was services for inmates and arrestees will be rushed to them because they have the authority of the government saying, give them their health care because it's an emergency, while those in the general public, perceived as representing criminal elements, will be at a risk of delay for healthcare services. So that's a dual phenomenon going on here. The literature review looked at other studies of emergency rooms. Previous studies found designation of being quote-unquote undeserving patients linked to poverty and race. Other studies found that emergency room staff focus on, quote, urgent care and disfavor non-urgent patients. Care is delayed for non-urgent and undeserving patients. Now, with the rise in incarceration, that means most families in poor families of color have family with a relationship to the criminal justice system. The language on welfare and criminal justice increasingly overlap and share stereotypes and punitive sanctions. So what was their public emergency room ethnography method? They studied a public emergency room in a large city attached to a hospital with 200 plus beds, somewhat vague to protect the anonymity of the institution, which city it was, which institution it was. They conducted 700 hours of participant observation, observing how incoming patients were assessed for how they were being assigned, the selection of some patients over others to get emergency room beds, how the arrival of police arrestees and jail inmates were dealt with, and notably how the police and the nurses assessing patients in waiting areas would actually be impacted by this arrival of the police. They used a combination of written notes and audio recordings while doing this whole set of ethnography. They recorded 1,114 admission decisions by following head nurses around as they made those decisions. So how did they code their observations, i.e., what was the operationalization of these broad concepts? They ended up looking at the decisions on admission into 6 possible types. A medical decision, based on medical criterion. Somebody is like hemorrhaging blood and they got immediate service. Easier case than some. Time of arrival decision, first come, first serve. Also relative, all things being equal, quite common. Here's where it gets more specific. Police jail arrival decision. Because somebody arrives with the police, did that get them a faster, bed, faster treatment? Criminal stigma decision. Is there evidence that one patient is chosen over another patient because the one passed over had some kind of criminal stigma? Separately, a fire ambulance decision. How are such ambulance arrivals also dealt with in speed and preference for getting treatment? And then there's a class unknown. Nurses were unclear on their decision or unwilling to explain. Okay, so what was the summary of the results? First, inmates, arrestees got priority for beds over many other patients, even those with more severe ailments. The police, having come into the waiting room, often end up expelling lower priority, what the author calls C-list patients who have low level, sickness and so on. And rather than stay in the room with the police either push them along or people leave of their own volition just because of their discomfort with the environment. They also found that pain medication is denied to patients, especially any patient seen as seeking opiates, if they are deemed criminal. So again, care can be changed based on how much somebody is deemed to be a criminal element. There's also, they looked for invocation of crime control language, and they found that often resolved what they call mid-range priority, B-list overcrowding decisions, where it's a severe ailment, they need to be seen, but the question is who gets seen first. They did find that medical criteria decided the majority of admissions, but criminal stigmatization and priority for arrestees and inmates affected nearly as many decisions. So those were critical parts of the decision-making in the process. So what's the implications of these results, having looked at all of this? One, it reinforced earlier studies that prison is a primary distributor of social services to the poor. If you're in prison, that's one of the best ways to actually get care if you have a medium to severe injury or other illness. It also supports other studies showing that ex-inmates are less likely to access public institutions. In this case, they observe because of the police presence and the policing of waiting rooms, it often drives out ex-inmates. And there are fewer beds available to the non-criminal urban poor because beds are being taken up by inmates, arrestees, and because of these general crime control stigmas. So what's the further research needed based on these studies? What it does show is through longer-term ethnographic research, you see how long-term effects of how disadvantage accumulates over the long term, not just due to initial disadvantages, but due to organizational decision-making that furthers the inequality and builds on it, and that you only see when you look through something like ethnography, the dynamics and decision-making process. The implications for how we think about police and schools is quite strong, that there might be spillover effects in promoting racial and economic disparity in outcomes there because of policing and how that might impact students. There are also broader theoretical implications for thinking about weighting, cues, as a mode of governmental statecraft and power, that without actually saying you're denied this resource, like healthcare or education, by rewarding and punishing different people online on slowing their ability to reach whatever resources are there, it actually does de facto shape who gets that resource and who doesn't. And this is what you get when you think about it from something like ethnography in this applied way, where what people might not be able to fully articulate in an interview, which you might not see in a cursory observation, This research showed that by embedding themselves in the hospital admissions process over months of time, it gave them the insight into how decisions were being made, talked to them, understood the norms and values that were powering that, and within that small system of decisions, gives us implications for a much broader set of decisions being made around this issue of waiting and queues. And it does raise the question of, with any method, what new insight do you get that might not be available to through other methods? And that's what we get out of ethnography, at least in this study.